Well, good morning, and today I have the privilege of leading you in the adult study, primarily because the full-time reverends are out of town. So I'm going to talk about certainty, and we'll start with this handout that is titled Who Baked the Cookies? It's written by Dhammadeepa Konin Cardenas, who is a Zen priest. So it starts with, Buddhist practice often asks us to question certainty, even when it appears to be based on solid information. Buddhist practice pokes holes in our certainty, crushes our proverbial soapbox, knocks over the proverbial stool on which we'd like to stand above the questions that plague a human life. In fact, Buddhism extols the virtue of simply not knowing. Yet how are we then to have strong belief in Buddhism? What is the benefit of questioning certainty? Is there anything truly skillful about not knowing? So this is a dialogue that is between two people, person A and person B. So if we take an everyday conversation between A and B as an example, it might help to illustrate this point. A, I don't know who baked those cookies, but I'm really glad they did. They were delicious. B, yeah, that was C. A, oh, did you help C bake the cookies? B, no, but C is always baking cookies. It was C. At first glance, this conversation may appear innocuous. A states they don't know who baked the cookies, and B uses their past experience to state that C baked them. However, if we're rigorous in examining this conversation, we might take note of the question that A posed. Was B actually present in the moment of baking cookies, therefore making their statement based on first-hand information? Another clarifying question would be asking whether B heard directly from C that they had baked the cookies. If neither of those things are true, then it seems that B cannot actually say with certainty that C baked the cookies. Now, one might think this is splitting hairs, a small matter really, and not worth even exploring further with B. Yet this conversation demonstrates how certainty has taken the place of not knowing, and how stating this certainty without any qualification has taken the place of seeing the situation more accurately. For example, B could have said, I imagine that C baked those cookies because they're always baking cookies around here. Such a statement would be more precise and would still convey B's idea about who had been baking. Still, it might seem trivial. Such a small difference in meaning doesn't have much bearing on the real world, one might think, and certainly not on such lofty matters as world peace or personal liberation. Keep investigating, for not knowing stands in contrast to knowing. Like background and foreground, both must be clearly seen if one is to integrate the whole picture. Suppose that C did not actually bake the cookies. Maybe C always bakes cookies, but since C always has to bake the cookies, D decided it would be helpful to bake the cookies this time. Then B's statement to A is misinformation. The mistaken statement is, perhaps accidentally, sowing the seeds of delusion, both in B's mind and in A's mind, by stating something that's not accurate. This is the opposite of finding clarity in the mind, the opposite of seeing clearly the reality before us. And there is an aspect of this exploration that is even more intriguing. Even if B was correct in saying that C had baked the cookies, the statement is still based on wrong view. It is wrong view based in treating an inference as an actual fact. Such an inference would be fine if it were specifically acknowledged, thereby clarifying the statement as a belief and not as a statement of fact. However, stated as a fact, when it is in reality an inference, is sowing the seeds of delusion in B's mind and in A's mind, because it fails to capture the truth of not having personal experience of the situation. It fails to capture the truth of not knowing. It fails to accurately describe the uncertainty that exists in B's relationship to the matter of who baked the cookies. Therefore, the statement is reinforcing wrong view. So, have you ever been very certain about something and turned out to be completely wrong? I know I have. And how often does that happen? A lot. I see nodding heads. For instance, this happens a lot. My husband can attest to it. I'll say, I told you to do thus and so. And he'll say, no, I didn't. And then moments later, I'll be faced with incontrovertible proof that I hadn't actually told him to do it, and I was wrong. Happens probably multiple times a day. And there are many other instances in which I am pretty sure about something or very sure about something, and I turn out to be completely wrong. So if we ask ourselves where certainty comes from, I think that certainty is based on our ability, our faith in our ability to accurately perceive reality and to make judgments and take actions based on our perceptions. So why do you think we look for certainty in life? Any ideas? It's comforting. Right. Do you think that as human beings we like to have answers to things? Yeah, it feels more secure. I think as human beings it's natural to want answers, and the more definitive, the better. Certainty gives us that sense of security, that sense of comfort in a world that can be confusing and chaotic. I know what's true, I'm certain of it, and I know where I stand. It's a way of maybe imposing some order, do you think, on the universe so that it makes sense to us? Is that fair? I think that how do we view uncertainty? How does uncertainty make us feel? I heard somebody say scared. Anything else? Confused? Did I hear anxious? Anything else? Yeah, I think for all those reasons that we kind of want to cling to certainty and we think of uncertainty as something that we want to avoid. I think even if the certainty that we have is about something unpleasant, like my boss is a jerk, we still want to hold tight to that, even if that's an unpleasant truth. You know, it's something, it becomes almost like an article of faith for us that we don't want to let go. If your belief is contradicted, how do you feel? I feel defensive. I mean, sometimes if somebody tells me I'm wrong and I'm not ready to acknowledge it, I double down, okay? I say, no, I'm really certain. So I thought I would maybe share an experience that a friend of mine had. He lives in the hills of Glendale, and in that area, fire and fear of fire is kind of ever present. And so one morning he's out on his back deck and he's having a cup of coffee and he sees like smoke in the distance. And he starts to freak out. There's a fire, it's on the next hill. And he even starts to see some flames as he runs into the house and he tells his wife, there's a fire on the next hill, grab the cats, I'll grab the important paperwork and let's get ready to evacuate. We might have to leave. And so he turns on the TV, he turns on the radio, he wants to find out, what's going on with the fire. And there's nothing on the news. And so he's like, what? This is crazy. So he calls 911 and he says, there's a fire, what am I supposed to do? And the 911 operator says to him, sir, you're mistaken. There is no fire in Glendale. And he said, I know there's a fire in Glendale. I can see it. And he's on his cell phone and he's walking out to his back deck. And he says, I can see the fire. I can see the flames. They're right on the next hill. They're headed this way. And he's like very insistent. He's arguing with the 911 operator. There's a fire on the next hill. And the operator said, sir, there is a fire, but it's on Mount Wilson, 60 miles away from you. And he was completely chagrined. He had to go in and calm the cats down. He had to tell his wife, no, I was wrong. We're not going to need to evacuate. So when he was faced with somebody telling him, you're wrong, he like insisted even more strongly that he was right. And I know I do that too. Do you think that society also can create a pressure to act like you are certain? Some of it might be you're in a role where you feel like you have to project confidence and certainty. If you're the boss or you're a CEO of a company, I guess there are times when you have to act as if you are certain about what you're saying. I'm confident about my earnings report, even though you may not be completely certain that things are going to turn out the way you say. So would you say certainty is always bad? Does certainty have a use for us? I would say yes. I would say that in our everyday life, like if you're raising kids, for instance, you have to say some things are certain, even if you know that there might be shades of gray, because you are trying to teach your kids how to live safely in the world. So you say, never touch anything that's on top of the hot stove, even though you know that there are safe ways of doing it. When you have a really little kid, you tell them, no, you can't do it. You say it with certainty, because that's how you have to teach your kids to be safe. I think that at work, we often have to act as if we are certain about things, because otherwise we'd be totally paralyzed. We would be overwhelmed with questions and doubts and uncertainty, and it would be really hard to function on a day-to-day basis. Everything would take twice as long. So there are uses for certainty. But taking it out of the realm of the everyday to religion, do you think people feel a need for certainty when they talk about spiritual matters or religion? Yeah, Eugene?
I think certainty can also be limiting and confining, and can lend itself to a dogmatic view, and it doesn't allow for flexibility, change, and broadening your perspective. But then knowing that is half of it, yes.
Anybody else have the, oh, I see a hand way in the back.
Not you. Oh. Mr. Blake.
Well, I know for me, coming from a Christian background, when certainty is sort of seen as faith, then certainty is almost a part of your religion. That how can you say you're religious if you're not certain about these things? So I think it can definitely have a power, and I think that power can also have a real downside if people are using that power over against other people.
So when you talk about certainty in religion, in certain religious traditions, does that mean that if you are uncertain that you're not being, faithful, that you're doing something wrong? I think that in some religious, I'm not intending to knock anybody's religious background, but I think that in some religious traditions, there's a right answer and there's a wrong answer. There's things that are supposed to be godly and things that aren't. And I think that maybe in religion, people are looking for certainty even more strongly than they do in everyday life, because what's religion about? It's about dealing with the big questions of life. It's about dealing with, why is there suffering in the world? Why do bad things happen to good people? Why is there evil? What happens after I die? So those are really big questions. Those are ultimate questions. Those are scary questions. And maybe in that realm, it's even scarier to think that there is no answer, right? you want to have an answer. So in religion, can you think of some of the ways in which in a religion that certainty is being provided?
Well, for me, the certainty is changing in myself, because after we get out this room, we don't know what's going to happen. So we are surrounded by the uncertainties. We don't know what's going to happen in the next second, right? We might have earthquake, and then what's going to happen? So we are surrounded by uncertainties. The only certainty I have is the connection to Buddha. So that's how I feel about certainty.
That's a good point, and I'm going to come back to that. I'm thinking now of religious traditions that might be different from Buddhism. For instance, maybe some of the ways in which certainty is conveyed in other religions might be through a religious doctrine or dogma. Like, for instance, is there a catechism or there are 10 commandments that say, this is a code of conduct? Maybe there might be some kind of spiritual authority, like a Bible or a Quran, that is meant to be taken, sometimes literally, that has, if it's in there, it's correct. It's the inerrant word of a deity. And maybe there might be some religions in which there's an ultimate spiritual authority. For instance, a pope, or somebody who's supposed to be the ultimate authority to whom, in spiritual matters, to whom you turn for answers. So I think that many, in fact, probably almost all religious traditions rely to some extent on certainty. And what I would like to suggest is that maybe Buddhism is somewhat different. I wanted to go back to something I said earlier about what certainty and what might be the problems with it. So what do you think is the problem with being certain about something? Does anybody have any thoughts about what's the problem with certainty? Why is certainty problematic? Yes, Stacy.
Certainty creates a problem for most of us if we're not willing to take on new information. That confirmation bias sets in, and we only look for the things that reinforce what we think we already know, and we ignore all other evidence to the contrary. And I think that pervades not only our spiritual lives, but our public lives and even our private lives to a degree that can be very detrimental to our well-being and those around us.
Thank you. Very good.
Actually, I'll add something too that I think when we, I'm trying to remember what I was going to say. Yeah, I'll come back to it. I can't remember.
I see another hand back there.
So I agree with her saying when you're certain, basically there's just some information is kind of lost somewhere or you're not ready to take. So there's a professor, if somebody may be knowing, Professor Lancaster, he's known in Buddhism in Berkeley University. And initial, almost like 30 years, he was certain that the Buddhism spread to the east from India only through the land and not through the sea route. And in last 20 years, when he went to India, Tamil Nadu, and saw, the Buddhism went through the sea route also. So then he's doing last 20 years research on the sea route. So that's his whole view got changed, but he missed that information in the beginning because he was certain that the information or Buddhism spread only through the land.
Yeah, I think that, as Stacy said, that if you're invested in a particular point of view and you're not taking in, other information, newer information, then you might be stuck in a wrong place. I think there was a time when everybody believed that the Earth was flat, right? And their new information came to establish that the Earth is not flat. But for centuries, or maybe even longer than that, people believed in this incorrect information because they weren't taking in anything contrary to what the point of view was. So you think that maybe the reality on which we base our certainty might be subjective, that it's not necessarily based on facts, but just on our view of the facts? Yeah, I think so. And what's another problem with certainty? I would say that if you're certain about something, doesn't that make it hard to admit that you've made a mistake? Yeah, isn't admitting that you've made a mistake one of the hardest things ever? Isn't apologizing for making a mistake even worse? Is even more painful? Because you feel foolish? Maybe that might be one of the things that's hard about certainty, is that you might be faced with the reality that you're wrong and you feel dumb. And maybe like B with the cookies, you're spreading misinformation. So you're not only wrong yourself, but you're sharing your wrongness with other people. And can being certain about something be a way of kind of propping up your ego? Have you seen people, have you yourself experienced being certain about something that you really didn't know, but you were, acting like you knew because it made you look better? Or you felt like you were in a situation where you had to act like you were in authority, that you knew what you were talking about? I think that happens a lot, right? And it's a way of propping up our ego self, because we are afraid to admit that we don't know. So I think that Buddhism is unique among religious traditions in turning away from certainty and embracing uncertainty. And I think, in fact, as we say, one of the central tenets of Buddhism is that everything is constantly changing and is therefore inherently uncertain. We also have this idea of non-self, that there is no such thing as an unchanging, permanent essence or a soul, something that's me. What we call ourselves in Buddhism, this idea of non-self, we say it's a never-ending flow of feelings and observations and reactions that are constantly changing in response to things that are going on around us. And so, that's uncertainty. Everything changing around us is kind of the very definition of uncertainty, and that is built into the worldview of Buddhism. So it's different from other religions in that we don't say, this is the unerring truth. This is the rules you have to follow to attain salvation. These aren't the rules that you have to follow to be a good person. In Buddhism, that path embraces uncertainty. And we don't even ask people to accept some of the central tenets of Buddhism on faith. I think, as the Buddha said from the beginning, we don't ask people to accept these ideas about everything is change or there's no permanent self. You don't have to take that on faith. That what you should do is compare that to your own experience of life and test it yourself and see, does that make sense to me? So let's go back to the handout. The Buddha gave discourse after discourse, exhorting people to investigate the nature of their firsthand experience. The Buddha taught that by accurately investigating firsthand experience, one might have an encounter with the Dharma, the law. In this context, Dharma can be understood as the nature of reality, which the Buddha described as apparent here and now, encouraging investigation to be experienced individually by the wise. So, I'm going to keep reading here. How do we begin to practice with our sense of certainty? When we're certain, even if we know that we need to be clear about not knowing. How can we get a foothold here? One place to start is to reflect on a time when your certainty was proven wrong. Returning to the cookie example, B might find a great opportunity for practice if they were to find out that D had baked the cookies and not C. First, B could observe their own reaction to being proven wrong, either privately or in public. Are they angry and defensive, lashing out verbally, or even physically at the messenger of the bad news? Are they depressed and self-critical, taking out their frustrations on themselves? Do they shrug it off, making it out to be a small matter, or even refusing to acknowledge the validity of the facts? Or do they laugh at themselves a bit and muse on the unpredictability of life? Often the type of reaction or response we offer to having been mistaken has more to do with the ways that we feel identified with a view than with the accuracy of the view itself. That is, the more we believe that certainty about an inferred view defines who we are or defines our value as a person, the more likely we are to have a strong negative reaction to the inaccuracy of that view. One way to practice skillfully with the news of having been wrong is to reflect on how that state of mind appeared. What was it that made us feel so certain about something that was incorrect? Where did we step in to fill a gap in knowledge with our own view? Was it that we knew that we did not know, but did not feel comfortable appearing uncertain? Do we feel that we must know in order to be a certain kind of person, or simply to be a person of value? Again, there seems to be a lot of societal pressure these days to appear to be certain about one's views. Starting with inquiry can help to open our minds and hearts to another perspective. I think maybe this is especially cogent now because we're in the middle of a political campaign season. And so there are a lot of people out there expressing views with a great deal of certainty, and a lot of us have probably made up our minds about, certain issues or certain candidates, and we're very certain of it, and we might not necessarily be interested in hearing other points of view. And we might be aggressive about defending our own view. We might be dismissive of other people's views. It's like we shut off our hearing mechanism because we're convinced, we're certain that our view is the correct one, or our candidate's view is the correct one. So I think what the author is saying here is that maybe we can use uncertainty in our Buddhist practice. I think that some people say that Buddhism is a path of practice and not belief. And so maybe, uncertainty, we can work with uncertainty and use it as a practice for ourselves to enhance our self-understanding. So, do you think asking questions could be a Buddhist practice? I see some nods. But is it hard to remember to ask yourself questions? I mean, usually we just react, right? Or we behave on the basis of what we think we know, and we don't ask ourselves, am I really sure about this? So it takes a certain amount of awareness and maybe commitment, discipline, something like that, to actually examine our beliefs and to say, do I really know that? Am I really right? Does that other person maybe have a point? I saw a hand.
I guess I was thinking in the limit of uncertainty, there's danger too, because you will tolerate much more behavior. At least it's a possibility, right? I'm thinking of, I'll just use global warming. Well, there's a lot of uncertainty there. So maybe that's an excuse for non-action. And for non-action.
Non-action.
Yeah, and so I think, at least in the way, I'm an engineer, and so, and I have to do risk assessments all the time. And one of the tools we use is what's called a 5x5 matrix. And you say, here's the likelihood of this event happening, and here's the consequence of this event. And then you can decide where you think that is, but it has to account for that uncertainty. And then you make an intelligent decision based on the best knowledge that you have at the time. And I don't know, that's my way of dealing with uncertainty. You can talk about, I don't want to go on a plane because, it might crash. But if you think about it logically, the way I eat is far worse than worrying about, a plane crash. So I don't know. It was just my thoughts on the subject. So
I see another hand.
Hi, I'm having this issues with a lot of my friends about the God question. They say you're a Buddhist, and they're certain. They says, Jane, when you said do you say the Pledge of Allegiance to your country? And I say, yeah. And it says the word God is in there. So, and when look at your dollar bill, in God we trust. When you go to the courts, like I've been in jury duty or whatever, I say, I promise to do it. So, so help me God. And when you say you're a Buddhist and they say, well, you don't believe in God, then you become like the outsider. Like even Judeo-Christians, Muslims, there is a God. And they say, what kind of, what is this? And I feel like, I guess American Buddhism, that book, like feeling like not American if you believe in God. And if you say, well, I think Buddhists, we're saying I'm uncertain, but that God question is really, I think, important. And it's so ingrained in me that sometimes I feel real uncomfortable when we say, even in Buddhism, they say, I've heard it here that we don't know, we don't say, Buddha didn't say anything about God. But with my friends especially, I'm like the outsider.
I think that's a really important point, and one of the questions that as Buddhists we have to, Buddhists living in America, and especially Jodo Shinshu Buddhists living in America, there could be this desire to want to have a religious path that offers more certainty, where you could say, I'm a Buddhist and this is what I believe. And there's a doctrine and there are rules. We live in a culture that's dominated by a Judeo-Christian ethic, as you say, and so it probably takes a certain amount of, I think you were talking about a kind of faith that maybe Shinjin, that maybe we could describe as confidence. Confidence, and confidence is not the same as certainty, I would say. And so to be a Buddhist and to stand up for your Buddhist path in a culture that is, not necessarily knowledgeable or tolerant of Buddhism, I think requires that kind of certainty that you have to know within yourself, not necessarily relying on, external, what other people say to define your identity. I see a hand in the back.
Yeah, I was thinking about the same thing about God and the uncertainty, but I think a couple of reverends were talking about us being more agnostic than atheist. So we don't know for certain if there is a God or if there isn't a God. So we're not saying we don't believe in God. I don't know if that's true or not, or if you can expand on that.
We're almost out of time, but I see Hector has his hand up. I could probably talk for quite a while on that, but.
I think it's important that we remember that just because a thought is very popular doesn't make it true. And so we are in a country where it's Christian dominant, and so for me, if someone was to tell me, well, I believe in a spaghetti monster in the sky, I mean, good for you, that's great. And the pressure is there, like for instance, the Pledge of Allegiance and the dollar bill, and like cartoons and TV and popular culture, it's everywhere. But I think Buddhism offers the most certainty, not because I'm Buddhist and because I'm here and I'm sitting there, but because it focuses on the here and the now and what you're perceiving. And then that's another question too, like what you view and your perception of something is you become certain of what you see, even though your viewpoint is your viewpoint. And so if I'm sitting here looking at something from afar, I have a viewpoint and I'm certain that what I'm seeing is what I see, but then someone else is at a different angle and they're certain that they see what they see, and so we all kind of see something. But at the same time, we're sort of like reacting to what is a visual stimuli, as opposed to other religions where it's like you don't see a God, but you have to believe in something you don't see. And I feel like that's way more uncertain for me, in my experience and growing up Christian. It felt like Christianity was the most, for me, my experience growing up Christian was the most uncertain, because you didn't see things that people talked about, and you just have to just believe because someone says. And so it's interesting for me when I don't really have religious discussions with people because, one, because I'm like, you can't argue something you can't prove. And so there's no point in arguing about something you can't prove. So it's really just your own personal viewpoints and philosophy. And so Buddhism for me seems most certain, because it's not telling you what you don't see, it's asking you, what do you see? And not just what do you visually see, because some of us are like blind and cannot see, but like what do you, what the consciousness do you see inside with yourself and reflecting upon yourself, and instead of someone telling you this is what it is. So I feel like it's more certain for me in my experiences, because it's reflective and it puts the responsibility on the individual of like, what do you see? And then also what you just mentioned today is the certainty portion of it, is then not questioning yourself. Because there's times where it's like, well, I'm certain this, but then being able to allow that space for question. The same thing for science. It's like a couple years ago, I went to school and Pluto was a planet, and that's science. You know what I mean? And so even with science itself, understanding that it is just whatever we are limited, and wherever we are, like whether it's science or Christianity or Buddhism, that we have to understand that it's our knowledge is limited and our viewpoints are limited. And I think that certainty is helpful, because we need to survive, and we need to move forward and push forward, and certainty helps us walk out the door.
And I think you touched on something very important too, which is that uncertainty is something that we could use in our self-examination. And what we say in Buddhism is that Buddhism is all about self-examination. And so I'm not going to read the last two paragraphs of this essay, because we're about out of time, but I think that what the author is getting at, and what you mentioned, Hector, is that we can benefit from embracing uncertainty, and one way that we can benefit from it is by recognizing that our wrong thinking, including false certainty, is recognizing our bonbu selves, our foolish, unenlightened selves, is the first step toward enlightenment, that self-knowledge, that self-examination. Another thing is that we can maybe embrace ambiguity and uncertainty as teachers rather than enemies. Accepting the uncertainty of life and maybe our own beliefs is humbling. We have to recognize and admit that we don't have answers, that our assumptions are often wrong, and that our judgments about what's good and bad are often mistaken. And so, that I think brings self-awareness to ourselves. And finally, I think that kind of humility and that kind of acceptance of uncertainty can maybe help us adapt to circumstances, to see multiple sides to a question, and look at ourselves and others with greater compassion and understanding. So when I say adapt to circumstances, for instance, you don't know, you're going through some kind of personal crisis. Maybe you've been diagnosed with a serious illness, and you don't know how it's going to turn out. You are dwelling in this kind of limbic atmosphere of uncertainty, but yet, because it's uncertain, that you can kind of, it's uncertain, but somehow you're going to be able to deal with it. And I think that's what I mean by adapting. It's going to be okay. That kind of, we talk of that kind of shinjin, that kind of feeling that everything is the way it should be, I'm accepted just the way I am, I think that's part of what we get from embracing uncertainty. So, thank you for listening. Please join me in Gassho. Namo Amida Butsu. Namo Amida Butsu. Namo Amida Butsu. Namanda.